Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, y'all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought that I would talk about this little topic that I found very particularly interesting. And I wanted to say first that I apologize if I haven't been posting as much lately. It's just there have not been as many conversations or topics that have necessarily drew my attention as much because, in the sport of boxing, especially, the fights that kind of get announced more the latter of the year, goes on and we're still only within the second month. But by March overall, there's probably going to be a lot more fights overall that have been recently announced. And I think all in all that, by then, there's going to be a lot more conversations. But we'll see what happens. Of course, we have heard certain fights that have been announced. I believe the Errol Spence Jr. versus Yordenis Ugas fight has been announced for April. Another fight I believe that maybe within the works could be Oscar Valdez versus Shakur Stevenson, although I believe nothing yet has been confirmed. At least that's what I've heard. And another fight I believe that has been confirmed for April as well has been that of Tyson Fury versus Dillian White, which of course in my opinion is a very, very big fight. That's a very, very interesting fight, that is going to happen. And I may talk about that a little bit later on. But of course one of the big fights that of course was supposed to happen and more than likely is still going to happen, but just probably within another month from now, is going to be that Mr. Jermell Charlo and Brain Castano. And of course for those of you that remember the first match that ended up happening last year, it was a very competitive fight. Of course the judges ended up scoring in a draw. I personally thought that if I was going to give it to anyone, that I probably would have given it to Brain Castano. But I do maybe understand why the fight was scored a draw. Jermell Charlo was somewhat able to climb back into the fight. In the second half of the fight, he was able to hurt him multiple times. I still thought that Brain Castano, in my view, did enough to win the fight. I probably would have gave it to him. But of course, this is boxing. And Jermell Charlo being the A side, I'm not very, very surprised, all in all, that he overall was able to escape with a draw in that fight. Now, of course, a lot of people, they may say, well, you just said all in all that you understood overall why the fight was scored a draw. So are you really saying that it was a robbery? No, I don't think that it was a robbery because I think that Brain Castano made it a little bit too competitive. But I still thought all in all that the judges more than likely still probably should have given the Brain Castano. But it is what it is. It was a very competitive fight. The bigger question is in the rematch, who necessarily is going to be the bigger fighter? Who necessarily is going to show up bigger in the big moments? Who is going to out-strategize the other? And this is a fight, in my view, that could really go either way. But of course, in recent news, Mr. Brain Castano, I believe, has pulled out of the rematch because of a slight bicep injury, or at least overall, he said that the fight needs to be postponed. Now, of course, what these regular channels do, like Aki TV, Boxing Ego, Dante's Boxing Nation, what their job basically is to be the opposite of ESPN. Just like how ESPN would be somewhat of Fox News, basically what new media's objective is to be CNN and basically put certain narratives out of proportion and a certain amount of other things. And that's why they've been starting to spread this narrative that not only is Brain Castano scared of Jermell Charlo, and who knows, maybe he could be. I'm not sure. It's just I'm not going to allege that 100% because overall Brain Castano put up quite a fight against Mr. Jermell Charlo. So we'll see all in all what happens. But at the end of the day, I'm not going to overall allege something unless I think all in all that there's a strong overall, direction more than likely that it is heading in that direction, or more than likely that there's a strong intuition or a good piece of data that supports that debate. And of course, a certain amount of these guys, basically what they're alleging now is that not only is Brain Castano scared of Jermell Charlo in the rematch, but that he's on steroids and all this other stuff, and that he's, apparently ducking VADA testing and yada yada. Apparently he hasn't taken VADA testing yet, and basically they're alleging that he's on steroids. And who knows? You never know. He could possibly be on steroids. You don't know. But at the end of the day, I'm not going to allege that with the fighter unless I have some very decently strong evidence. And I'm already a person overall that has stated multiple times in my view that more than likely a lot of these fighters are probably on some sort of PEDs or steroids anyway. It just is what it is. I believe that the majority of these athletes are anyway, especially these fighters. But it is what it is. But at the end of the day, I think that this fight, still at this point in time, I still do believe that this is a 50-50 fight. And I'm not a person all in all that just, roots for someone 100% all in all because they're my own same demographic or yada yada when it comes down to it. I really don't care who wins this fight. And to be quite honest with you, I think that this fight, when it comes down to it, I do think that it is a 50-50 fight. And I already told people this, even though I think that this is a very big fight and I think that this is a very decent fight, I don't necessarily believe that the winner of this fight would 100%, at least for sure, be on my top 10 pound per pound list or, 100% deserve a spot 100% on the top 10 pound per pound list. And I know a lot of people are going to take a look at me and say, wow, why the hell would you say that? Because at the end of the day, when I take a look at Jermell Charlo and Brain Castano, I don't really view those fighters as the creme de la creme. I personally view Brain Castano as the more talented fighter than that of Jermell Charlo, but that doesn't mean that Jermell Charlo does not have a very decent chance in this fight. He's a little bit bigger than Brain Castano. He's lengthier. He has very decent power. And Brian Castano, he probably should have won that fight last time a little bit more convincingly. I thought that personally he probably did enough just to win the fight, but I thought that maybe he could have did it more convincingly by not getting hit several times in the latter part of the rounds and getting hurt a few more times, probably getting Jermell Charlo or giving the judges more of an excuse to score it, that much closer. So at the end of the day, Brian Castano, I think all in all that he has to be very keenly focused in this fight. I think all in all that he has to have the right strategy. I think all in all that basically, he has to pressure Charlo. I think all in all that he has to try to get in there with his jab, get the left hook in there. And when it comes to Mr. Jermell Charlo, I think that sometimes he has to be not afraid to back up Brian Castano. I think that sometimes overall that he has to use his jab as well, go to the body, go to the head, throw that right hand down the pipe when it comes down to it. And sometimes you are going to have to try to back Brian Castano up. Because if these fighters, all in all, if they don't capitalize right, and overall, if they don't end up gaining the other fighters' respect, if Jermell Charlo does not end up gaining Brian Castano's respect, it's going to be a very tough night for Mr. Jermell Charlo. And if Brian Castano does not end up gaining Jermell Charlo's respect in certain areas, it's going to be a very long night for Brian Castano. So we'll see all in all what ends up happening. This is a very close fight, and I do believe that this still is a 50-50 fight. We will see all in all what ends up happening with Mr. Brian Castano. We'll see all in all, whether they end up having them fight their mandatories next because now the postponement has happened, or overall, if the fight will still happen. I believe more than likely that the fight will still happen, but it will be very, very interesting overall to see how this necessarily goes out. I think that's going to be very, very interesting. But the reason all in all why I say, the reason why I say the winner of this fight, in my view, may not be in the top 10 pound for pound list still, even though you certainly could debate them there, is because when I just take a look at them, not only, sure, they would unify all the belts, but when you really take a look at their resume, there's just really no fighters there besides themselves, Jermell Charlo and Brian Castano, that really overall would be classified as A grade. I mean, who really else are you going to rank that's A grade there? Is it going to be Jarrett Hurd, who lost his last fight to a journeyman? Is it going to be Joey J.R. Williams, who has gotten knocked out now 3 times in his career when it comes down to it? Or beaten 3 times in his career, last time lost to a journeyman? Is it going to be Jason Rosario, who really doesn't seem to have the boxing skills? Is it going to be that overall of Erickson Lubin, who is a decent fighter, but not really that great of a fighter? I just don't think that 154 is really a division to where they really have a great amount of talent. That's not me saying that some of the fighters are not, somewhat skilled there, but to me, that's really one of the weaker divisions in all of boxing. And I know a lot of people that are going to heavily disagree. In my view, what would really put Jermell Charlo or Brian Castano up high in the pound for pound list, maybe even put them within my top 5 pound for pound, is overall basically them, when it comes down to it, basically it would be them defeating that of a Terrence Bud Crawford or overall, Errol Spence Jr. That basically overall would be the thing overall that you would have to do, because I don't think unifying that division, in my view, at least I would not put you within my top 5 pound for pound. It's just not enough, because I don't think that either fighter is extraordinarily skilled. Like when I watch a Canelo Alvarez, to be quite honest with you, I'm not even sure if either fighter is as skilled as what I've seen from overall as a Jermell Charlo. It just is what it is. I don't even think that Jermell Charlo is as skilled as his, bigger brother Jermall Charlo. Is Brian Castano more skilled? Maybe. We'll see. But I thought all in all that even with his skill that he showed in the first fight, that overall he respected Jermell Charlo's power a little bit too much. Don't get me wrong. You need to respect him to a degree, but he gave him a little bit too much respect in my view. But of course, a certain amount of these new media channels, they love to use Jermell Charlo's name not only because he's a Black American fighter, but of course because they try to use him and say, oh, well, he's a black fighter, so of course they don't have him on the top 10 pound for pound list, even though he's done this, done that. Well, we can say that all we want to, but at the end of the day, for those of us that are even logical and objective, and I'll include myself within that category because I do find myself logical and objective, I don't have Jermell Charlo on my top 10 pound per pound list. I have him within my top 20, but I can't really have him within my top 10 because, who really have you beat? You beat Jason Rosario, you beat overall, Erickson Lubin. One would classify those wins as decent, but I'm not really going to classify those as A-grade wins. Would those fighters overall really stand a chance against someone that actually is a very, very decent fighter? Like, let me ask you this. Would any of those fighters actually beat a Primary Sonny Lara or Golovkin or Canelo? If they were if they fought them, no. They wouldn't even last more than likely. It just is what it is. And Jermell Charlo, not too long ago, he even lost to Tony Harrison, who pretty much, I don't want to call him a journeyman, but he's a person that has had a very big amount of trouble winning his biggest fights. And even in the rematch where Jermell Charlo ended up knocking him out, some would even argue that he was losing that fight before he ended up knocking him out. So it just is what it is. So at the end of the day, Jermell Charlo, I cannot have him in my top 10 pound per pound list. Yes, you have the belts, but you pretty much lost to a B-grade fighter. debatably a C-grade fighter. It just is what it is. And as for Brian Castano, if he even debatably wants to break my top 10 pound for pound list, he is going to have to win this rematch. But we'll see on the know what happens. And I think that for Brian Castano, maybe there's more of an argument that maybe he can make the pound for pound list just because he's undefeated. But Jermell Charlo, you certainly can make a case for as well. We'll see on the know what happens. But anyways, I think that this is a very interesting fight. I think all in all that both fighters are going to have to be very keenly focused, very intelligent. I think all in all that they're going to have the right strategy. I think that both somewhat are going to have to employ their jab in there. I think that Mr. Brian Castano, the punches that he is going to want to put in there is the jab and the left hook when it comes down to it, both to the body and both to the head. When it comes down to it, try to get that little good right cross in there as well. You're going to have to pressure Jermell Charlo, in my view, overall to somewhat outbox him. You can somewhat outbox him in the middle of the ring, but you're also going to have to pressure him because Jermell Charlo is more lengthier than you when it comes down to he's bigger than you in terms of height and reach. So basically, the more in the middle of the ring that it is, especially with Mr. Jermell Charlo's power, overall, the more likely is going to favor Mr. Jermell Charlo. As for Jermell Charlo, overall, in my view, you're either going to want to have Brian Castano in two positions in the middle of the ring or up against the ropes. So we'll see all in all what ends up happening there. But I think that this fight is very particularly interesting. We will see overall what happens. But that's pretty much about it for today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll talk to you all later.